Rare has always been a company that strived to push out unique IPs. Throughout their catalog, we have tons of games that are both high in quality and character. But sequels to games? We have few. In my own opinion, it feels like after Rare made the transition to Xbox, they didn't want to create sequels and instead wanted to push new IPs and experiment. This move really came straight from the top, the Stamper Brothers. They wanted to test the waters with new genres and new creative endeavors to help create a new lineup for the Xbox family they found themselves in now. Today, I want to specifically look at the lost sequels from Rare's IPs we never got. Some on this list had a development cycle and were ultimately canned, some couldn't even get past initial concepts, and some had multiple sequels that kept being reworked until ultimately being lost to time. Some of these games became childhood dreams that never happened. Well, I guess I'm gonna open that deep nostalgia wound and see what could have been. These are in no particular chronological order, but just dropping every mention or bit of info I can find. As we go, be sure to watch the corner for suggested videos, as I've covered some of these series specifically and go into even more depth on them and their canceled sequels. So if you're interested in a particular title, maybe check some of those videos out. But for now, let's start this list by looking at all the unreleased sequels we are aware of for Banjo Kazooie. Banjo 3E. Ah yes, the game I'd been waiting a good portion of my life for. Teased at the end of 2E, much like 2E itself was at the end of Kazooie, 3E was never actually a thing, according to Greg Mails, and they never intended to make a game in a similar style to the first two, which breaks my heart. But it wasn't the only sequel that never was. Banjo Kazooie. There was a time where Banjo was going to have a traditional kart racer like Mario Kart or Diddy Kong Racing. As a precursor to Nuts and Bolts, this game saw the concept of Banjo in a kart that you could build from different pieces. When I interviewed Michael Kaywood, a former animator at Rare, he had some storyboard concepts he worked on for this unreleased Banjo Kart game. These storyboards come from very early on. Programmer Brendan Gunn stated he had a good 2 weeks working on this kart racer for Xbox doing the driving mechanics. There isn't much info out there other than that. Ultimately, the concept for the game was scrapped. However, one of the karts that was designed for it did make its way with Banjo into Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing on the 360 as an exclusive character. Yeah, that's where that little red kart comes from. There was another kart racer planned called the Fast and the Furious, which would feature Banjo, Conker, and potentially other Rare characters. It's not really a sequel, but more like a fun party kart racer worth mentioning. It was going to be a game inspired by Diddy Kong Racing and focus on kart and track customization. But other than concept art, that's all we have. As you'll see from this list, Rare had a lot of kart racer ideas. Banjo X. This is one of the more popular conceptualized entries. I would wager to say this sort of started as a GameCube tech demo. You know, the one we saw Banjo and Kazooie running from every Banjo character ever. The prospect of a next-gen at the time Banjo Kazooie was in everyone's mind, and as Rare made its home over at Xbox, Banjo X was designated to be a retelling of the first Banjo Kazooie game. Events would play out similarly as the first game, but as you enter levels, characters would remember you defeating them and would behave differently, giving the game a fresh take. It's a really interesting concept and honestly way more thoughtful and interesting as a remake. I wish more remakes were more like that, giving a new experience while still feeling familiar. This concept did morph and change though, leading to a multiplayer concept where players would work together to solve puzzles. An inspiration for this seems to be Zelda 4 Swords. Then finally, it morphed into a game where Banjo and Kazooie would compete against Gruntilda, but the AI got too advanced for the time and it was ultimately scrapped. Eventually, the ideas for this game and the scrapped kart racer merged and the game morphed into its final form. Nuts and Bolts. Grunty's Curse. This is the original title of what would be Grunty's Revenge. Though rather than for the Game Boy Advance, this game would have been released on the Game Boy Color. The game's plot would feature some similar ideas like Mecha Grunty, but the timeline would take place years after Banjo Kazooie and would center around your friends all being cursed, even Kazooie. Banjo would have at least started out solo, like in Grunty's Revenge, and Bottle's grandfather Grandpa Mole would teach you some things. The game would center around freeing your friends from the curses and gathering magical items. Another Game Boy follow-up, Grunty's Other Revenge, would have been a direct follow-up to Grunty's Revenge, but rather than Game Boy Advance, it would have been released on the Nintendo DS. It's believed 3D models would have been placed on 2D backgrounds. This could have been a really interesting title. It's a shame we don't ever get to see it. Banjo Kazooie Connect. This wasn't ever set to release on consoles, but it did have a playable build by Audience Entertainment, exclusively for the 2015 South by Southwest Awards. It would see Banjo and Kazooie fly forward on rails, and using the Kinect Players would raise and lower them to collect notes and jiggies. Nothing too exciting, but it was a thing and used the nuts and bolts models. And finally, Jiggy Juggle. This would be an original puzzle game that actually started out as a Donkey Kong title called Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers. This title would swap over to Banjo because Rare moved over to Microsoft and an original game required an original IP not under Nintendo. This game would go on into development and see a release as It's Mr. Pants on the Game Boy Advance. Since we talked about DK, let's move on to some scrap sequels for the ape himself. Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers, as mentioned, started out life as a DK puzzle game. But aside from a game that morphed into others, DK had a few other entries planned, like Donkey Kong Country 4 on DS. Yeah, you heard that right, an original sequel to the SNES entries in the 2D style was almost a thing. Rare's Tim Stamper suggested to the team they could make a new entry. This was coming off the heels of the GBA remakes. Now that they had the engine down and everything looked good, it would have been easy for them to use that engine to drop in new assets and create a new experience. Plus, members of the team were fresh off of rebuilding the levels and design of the original trilogy, so they would be primed for making a new similar experience. Unfortunately, this project, along with the proposed Grunty's Revenge sequel, were scrapped in favor of recreating Diddy Kong Racing on the DS. This next scrapped idea had me really excited, Donkey Kong Voyage. This was intended to be a direct follow-up to the legendary Donkey Kong 64. This would have been a 3D collectathon game for the GameCube. This project didn't get too far off the ground, and to my knowledge, nothing was released publicly other than some familiar names would have been working on it. This game being scrapped was a direct result of the Microsoft acquisition. Now we segue into the smaller Kong, Diddy Kong. While this next one technically would be a Donkey Kong game in title, it would have been a direct sequel to Diddy Kong Racing, Donkey Kong Racing. It was a scrapped GameCube follow-up to the original kart racing adventure. We have a very cool teaser trailer and some art. This project unfortunately was scrapped again with the acquisition of Rare by Microsoft. The game's mechanics would have focused more around animal buddies this go around, and players leveling them up by feeding them fruit. It seems like as Diddy Kong Racing had a water-based vehicle, air-based vehicle, and a ground-based one, the animal buddies would be able to be used by every character, and different races required different types. Like Rambi for ground types, On Guard for underwater races, and possible zingers for aerial races. Characters like Taj would return while also bringing in a lot of the DK crew from 64. It's a shame this game never saw the light. It would have been epic. It wasn't the only lost sequel of Diddy Kong Racing though. We also had Diddy Kong Pilot. We were blessed to have a very cool build of the game on record from a former Rare team member, so we do get to see a bit of what this game would have been like. Other than that, not too much is known. Many characters would return, but we'd also see Donkey, Dixie, Cranky, and a new Kong called Redneck Kong. But that character would ultimately get scrapped and replaced by Candy Kong. We would also see K. Rool join the race. This game mechanically would have focused on airplanes, and ultimately with the buyout I'm sure you're sick of hearing about, would morph into Banjo Pilot, a decent racer title on the GBA. And what if I told you this wasn't the only other scrap sequel to Diddy Kong Racing? Yeah, that game had 3 potential sequels that never saw the light. At this point, I'm convinced Nintendo just didn't want to make money. Diddy Kong Racing Adventure would have been the name of the other scrap sequel. However, this title wasn't pitched or developed by Rare. It was actually pitched by Climax Group around 2004, and they built a prototype on the original Xbox, but wanting it to be on GameCube, which is pretty ironic. The build is playable and what you're seeing. Though it's not Rare, I really wanted to include it to show how big Diddy Kong Racing could have been as a franchise, but Nintendo nipped it. I'm assuming they didn't want their other popular kart racer to have internal competition. But you know what? The more the merrier, I say. Let's dive into Perfect Dark now, as the game series ended up having 2 scrap sequels. Well, 3 if you count the recent cancellation, but I'll stick with the rare ones from here on out. Velvet Dark. This would have followed Joanna Dark's sister, Velvet. I find conflicting reports that it is her sister, as some say the relationship was not confirmed, though most believe this is the case. The game actually started conceptualization in '99, and in 2000 Rare filed a trademark and a domain site under that title. Velvet would have played more like a third-person action game, sort of like Tomb Raider, as Nintendo was pining for an answer to those style of games, and Rare wanted to expand their catalog with different styles and genres. From what I can tell, the team spent a year developing Velvet Dark, so it had some real progress made on it. From documents, we can also see Velvet would have been able to use serums to give her enhanced abilities. Other than that, we can see the Velvet model appear in Perfect Dark as a standard co-op player. Perfect Dark Core. It was a direct sequel planned to continue Joanna Dark's story. Development of this game began after the 360 prequel Perfect Dark Zero around 2005. While Joanna was originally intended to be the main character, she was a bit rougher than we were used to, and rather than the cool collected spy she was more of a hardened chain smoker at this point. Eventually in development, an unknown male protagonist was made the main character. The concept would evolve until it wasn't even a Perfect Dark title and focused around a mech. Then it was ultimately cancelled. Now it's time for everyone's favorite squirrel, Conker. Conker's Other Bad Day. This may be one of the most famous scrap sequels on this list, probably because Chris Seaver has leaked so many plot points in concept art, you can't help but get excited for the direction of this game. I mean, the return of the Great Mighty Pooh, Barry's an evil cyborg, and we follow up a lot of the cast we came to love from the first game, as well as new characters like Bunny the Rabbit, who would be a new love interest for Conker. The whole game would have been way more story-driven than how the first one went from joke to joke, and it would follow Conker's failure at ruling the kingdom. I hope one day this one sees the light of day. We need more Conker stories. And yes, it could work today. Conker Getting Medieval. A lost multiplayer game following up on the online multiplayer mode on Live and Reloaded. Greg the Grim Reaper would have been the main character and would have been a straight-up team-based third-person shooter game, but medieval-themed. We got some cool artwork from Rare Replay, but that's about it. Let me also just throw in here Conker's Big Reunion, because that never actually finished, but it also was a follow-up. I will count it as a sequel, even if it's an in-game engine game. Just worth a mention. Kameo, another Xbox title, also had a cancelled sequel with Kameo 2. This sequel would have been a much darker experience than the first. It would see the return of the Mystic being the main villain, leading a race of serpent-like creatures, directly continuing the end of the first game. Kameo would now have stealth mechanics and wraith abilities to take out foes in addition to her transformations. She was noted to be tainted by her inner darkness. We had a lot of cool concept art, but unfortunately this game was cancelled due to the poor sales of the first game, though I think Kameo deserves another shot at life. Kameo isn't the only Xbox release that had a sequel conceptualized. Grabbed by the Ghoulies also had a pitched sequel, Ghoulies 2. The game would be a direct follow-up and would take place in Ghoulville in the Gloom. It's largely believed it would be an open roam 3D adventure, much how the first game was actually intended originally before being transitioned to Xbox and forced to scale down. This game wouldn't see much development other than some plot conceptualization, but this could have been a really cool spooky platformer adventure. We do at least get a little logo art at the end of Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, along with Cake Filler Instinct, Viva Pinata Kart, Banjo Kazooie Bash Baddies, and a Battletoads game, though the Ghoulies sequel is the only potentially real one and the others are jokes. Throwing it back a bit, Battletoads also had a scrap sequel. One on the Game Boy Advance specifically that would have featured pre-rendered sprites much like the Donkey Kong Country games and would see the Toads revisit some familiar worlds, ultimately being a sequel though. Before this game was scrapped, we did get a prototype build, which is what you're seeing here. Jet Force Gemini would have seen a sequel on a portable console as well, though not the GBA, but the Game Boy Color. It would have been outsourced to Bit Studio. We don't know too much about it, but we do have a few screenshots and some music. And, as I was making this video, I found out there is actually some leaked gameplay. Someone has a build of it on Game Boy and they played it. Check it out. Going back even further, back to when Rare was Ultimate Play the game, they had a little series called SabreWulf, where we'd follow Sabreman the Explorer. They spanned across several games and titles, but they would have 2 scrap sequels. Assuming the first would be on the ZX Spectrum as an original follow-up to Pentagram, the last in the series before the GBA release many years later, Mire Mare. The title is teased at the completion of the previous entry, stating your adventure continues and to go forth to Mire Mare. Rare revealed in the 90s that it would have played a lot like SabreWulf, but from a top-down perspective. But the coding was never completed on it, even though rumors said otherwise. Another scrap sequel came after the cancelled Donkey Kong Racing. Not wanting to lose all the work on Donkey Kong Racing, we almost got Saberman Stampede on Xbox. This is a very interesting one because it saw a similar animal buddy mechanic, but converted it into a safari adventure where you'd have to capture animals. We have footage of this game in action, and it's actually really cool looking. And the final title I'll mention, Rare also wanted to create a sequel to Snake, Rattle, and Roll on NES, but on the Super Nintendo, and call it Snakes in Space. It would have played similarly, but would lean into B-rated movie sci-fi stuff like UFOs and aliens. And with all that, that's all I have for you. Have you heard of any of these sequels? Are there any you're aware of I didn't cover? Let me know in the comments. Please drop a like to help spread my content and subscribe so you don't miss a future upload. Until next time, have a good one.